Hello everyone, today we talk about 12th century Scandinavian militiamen and especially their equipment and their broader military culture. In this phase of Scandinavian history, it is quite important that we discussed recently in videos like From Hird to Chivalry, History of a Cultural Direction, but also the characteristics of the northern kingdoms in the Low Middle Ages and the Leidang conscription between the 11th and the 13th century. So it's more or less these times now. And looking at militiamen, or essentially levy peasants and slash warriors at this point, because this is what we will essentially try to emphasize, the very progressive transition that Scandinavian kingdoms had from their tribal past into what feudalism was. So we won't be repeating much ourselves, especially after those videos, but it's important to stress here that Scandinavia has is undergoing fundamentally certain changes that have to do with the import of the vassalic beneficiary system from Western Europe. At the same time, it has certain infrastructural limits in order to applicate the system to make it work both from a political and military point of view. And third, that Scandinavia, and especially certain areas of it, are exposed to a lot actually of Eastern influences that are reflected also into their equipment, an equipment that remains largely conservative, right? By terms of material culture, there are relatively few changes over time, but they're still important to highlight. And naturally, different areas of Scandinavia have different transformations, right? In the south, Denmark differentiates from Scandinavia proper because it's fundamentally much more similar to the continental Frankish powers. The far north has specific characteristics. So why is it important to focus here on the militia, and what are we talking about objectively? Because the militia here is fundamentally an equivalent to the Leidang levy, right? In the relative video, we discussed that, especially in between this centuries, you know that the Leidang fundamentally existed already into the Viking era. It was the basic Scandinavian levy system at the time. It was both about men and ships, especially for the most sea-faring populations, that at this point starts becoming a tool fundamentally for the local monarchies to provide this bulk of more than man, let's say money, because there is this, or other goods, generally speaking, in order to centralize respectively. And the Viking era had brought two great changes at the roots of Scandinavian society, changes that were, as we've seen, were relatively superficial compared to other areas of Europe, but that had set this trend that makes also Scandinavia evolving slowly towards feudalism, right? But these changes had been important because objectively the Viking era changed the traditionalist state, let's say, of Scandinavia, right? The tribal system enters in crisis. There are these new chiefs that are entrepreneurs, mercenaries. Obviously, they have this aggressive and different mind that from what the original Germanic egalitarism was about. The Viking raids, aside from all the reasons that have to do seemingly largely with the demographic dynamics, I mean the idea that was seemingly a warming of the climate, that for which not really fertility, but you know, especially child that rate diminished, so there were more mouths to feed, and as a consequence, Scandinavia in its hinterland didn't offer many opportunities, so these people had to take the sea. As you know, the Vikings fundamentally weren't just about piracy and trade, but were also about settling, right? There is some endemic settlement in faraway places, as you know, even up to the American continent, and yet this is a system that, especially into the North Sea, starts acquiring, much different phases. There is the development probably of monarchies, of this powerful political leaders that acquired their power through raid on large scales, and this kind of raiding parties that evolve as, just from small bands that hit here and there to entire armies that remain for entire months into enemy soil, just to pillage, to draw resources, and to bring them back to Scandinavia, where this can be used in order to reinforce the local rule in a world that had basically not known much big deal of centralization, as it was being developed, for example, into the Frankish world, right? So it's very fascinating and thought-provoking to frame this, and in this scenario, the traditional Leidang is very important, because it represents still the tribal element in many ways. For one side, you have the royal and noble retinues of the Scandinavian monarchs that are working in this increasingly private system with the entrusting of land and and sharing this models of power, the aristocratic view of the world that is inspired directly to the Frankish world. And this happens for many peoples around. From the other side, you have the Militia of Freeman, right? Because traditionally in Scandinavia, like in basically most of all the tribal populations that had existed, and in certain cases would keep existing, that being a freeman equated to be a warrior, right? So this picture is should be dimensioned in time and space, because things change, as we have seen here in a diachronic perspective. But let's say that Scandinavia, on average, compared to other areas of Europe, maintains this stronger, let's say, militias, right? This stronger tribal or popular element that is able to counter relatively the rise of aristocracies more than what in other areas of Europe happens, right? And this happens not because of a particular strength. The tribal levies are not the symptom of an excessively developed society. It's more of the lack of resources, in fact, that make, generally speaking, less surplus available, so that more or less everybody has the same amount of wealth, even though naturally aristocracies had always ruled, right? This is not a world where aristocracies popped out just with the Viking era, right? That they had aristocracies, how they were actually some of the most traditionalist element in this sense, because when they talk about freemen, they actually were talking about themselves as oligarchs, as aristocrats, against some overlord, like a king could be, right? So definitely these were all clientelary systems that were fueled by inequalities of some sort. There was always someone who was more powerful, that owned more land, more cattle, and that therefore had. But there is also more. Like, there are certain areas that were also where the Scandinavians expand to find a new life, a new land to settle. Where, like Finland, for example, but also other areas of the far north, take Iceland, etc., where aristocracies is more like a gentry, fundamentally. They never reach higher, so there is a substantial degree of equality that remains, but also at the same time a less general capability as political and military powers, right? Monarchies function better in this sense, and this is mostly pioneered in continental Europe, though. But it's a very complex system now, because we're talking about the 12th century, right, as this moment of, where in other areas of Europe, monarchies are taking shape finally, right, and where, as we said before, Scandinavia is still relatively lagging behind. So, and looking at the potential, let's say, as we were saying at the beginning, there's this effort from the side of the monarchies to kind of frame and regulate the Leidang levy, right? And there's this even historical problem between the theoretical and practical amount of men that could be raised. We talk about sometimes, the potential of the levy was actually considerable. These are properly kingdoms now, right? Even if they are still kept together with great difficulty, but there is an idea that, from one side you have Norway, on the other side Denmark. For example, in 1124, looking at ships, Norway seemingly could raise something like 360. Denmark 720 by 1137, right? The latter figure rising to 860 ships and 30,000 men before the end of the century, and reaching, allegedly, but this is the theoretical thing, but 1,400 ships and 160,000 men, including 1,400 knights and as many crossbowmen, by the time of King Valdemar the Victorious in the first half of the 13th century. So these are naturally ideal numbers that are based on the concept that theoretically, considering all the subjects of the kingdom, all the men in arms, all the freemen could theoretically join. Naturally, real armies were much smaller, and especially it was very, very difficult, even if there had been the political consensus to put them together, to maintain them logistically, right? So there is also quite high degree of political fragmentation. When in early 13th century Norway could levy seemingly 14,000 men and 309 ships at the beginning of the 13th century as a regular peacetime muster, which means that there was a sort of rota basis of the freemen for the military service in the range of like 3 years. I don't know, it depends on which fraction you want to consider, for this, because this was a way for the kingdom to essentially know if they could rely on a certain amount of troops in case of emergency, while theoretically the full Leidang was something like Fort Norway at that point 40,000 men, right? But still they are quite rarely put on the field in practice, because these are fundamentally just numbers. And still, the most important thing probably to remember at this point is that when we say men here, doesn't literally mean that these people went physically to the Leidang, right? They usually paid for it, right? This is typical, right? And it increases, especially with the affirmation of monarchies that are interested at that point for obvious reasons. There is a kind of a mutual consensus by many standards. This is how many lordships during the Middle Ages, as in other periods, actually were born, right? From one side, you have someone who wants to rule and already has the capability of ruling, right? Can already provide with some effective military of sort, with essentially with professional troops, this faithful retinues like the host guards and so on. From the other side, you have the mass of the peasants, of the farmers, that fundamentally do not care a big deal about war, because they have to think about their harvest, about their cattle, and to feed their families. So war is usually the worst, right? They may be, individually speaking, skilled fighters of some sort, not really anything exceptional, really, but all what is necessary for little cattle raiding warfare and stuff like that. But going to a military expedition, maybe even overseas, is something you're not greatly interested in. So at that point, you do something very clever. And instead of presenting yourself to the army, as it was traditionally done in the past, you simply pay for it in exchange for your presence with some amount of of resources or even money at one point, based naturally on the wealth that you own. That is, at this point, like the land that you occupied or the cattle that you owned, right? And these militias are interesting because they maintain, in many ways, certain similar characteristics with the ones of the past. Looking at their equipment, right? We can try to make a profile of these troops, right? Starting from helmets, that is interesting at this point. There is evidence because naturally, by the way, the militia starts at this point being issued by written law. You know that the Scandinavian countries fundamentally get to write only when they're Christianized, and naturally the building of a monarchy, the structuration of a monarchy, does entail some form of local administration of writings, of accounts, and the laws are written down. This high recruitment lists have to be written in some way. So at that point, you can study, what is owed in terms of military service on the base of wealth, which is usually associated with a certain kind of equipment, right? This is typical and standard throughout all medieval Europe, right? It's the basic hairband that existed since ever, right? Even traditionally, even Rome had the same thing. And it's interesting, starting from helmets, to observe that, which is not something, helmets are, first of all, in terms of the protection of your head, something you rarely see in movies, basically. But if you are going to wear any kind of armor, really, if you have anything to spend for the protection of your body in combat, the first one you wanna protect instinctively, think about it right now, thinking about your body, is your head, right? It's obvious, and that's the one you wanna. So helmets are to be found much more than is commonly thought in popular culture as the essential, like the first type of armor that you want to wear, right? It may still be kind of organic material, so it doesn't necessarily have to be metal. And talking about Scandinavia in the 12th century, well, definitely the per capita wealth was not very high, to say the least. So any metal part, etc., was already quite a big deal, right? Even, not just a sword that we will see then, but even a helmet could be something very, very expensive. But it's very interesting in this sense to observe that in Denmark, in Sweden, and probably Norway too, but I don't think they're documented by this time, that iron helmets had become part of the militiaman's basic equipment by the 12th century at the latest, right? This is particularly interesting because as we were saying, it's not such an enormously common feature to have available metal so easily. But if you really want to have it, concentrated on that, and consider that some spear or arrowheads this time in certain Scandinavian contexts, especially in the far north, in places like Iceland, etc., were still made of stone, right? Something like early Middle Ages more. So it was that primitive. This is something that was the norm, like in the ancient world, but not even that. Maybe in the northern Europe as a whole, but there is that degree. Sometimes, if you don't have enough resource available, that's what you can work with. Even with bone, that were entire. If you look at certain peoples of Siberia, they even had bone or wood armor, and surely wood armor could be used at this point as well. So that's the degree of material poverty that you find in this time. And the typical helmet form in this period between the 11th and the 12th century remained actually the old conical type with a nose guard, right? Other types of helmet naturally have been found, also at Viking sites, and that were clearly associated to Scandinavian warriors. For example, there is the distinctive Geirmundby style helmet. So then talking about the shields, by the 11th century, as you know, the kind of the iconic type of shield is the round one. It was usually made of poplar or alder wood. Its thickness varied between something like between 1 centimeter to 2.5, so 1 inch roughly. And they the best ones were built with glued layers. Each layer placed at the angle to that beneath, and the wall being covered with leather, so that this preserved all the wood inside. And this last laminated form though was not very common, right? The thinner type or round shield was more widespread. This is particularly interesting because, well, okay, maybe we're pushing it too far as an hypothesis, but the idea, however, is that aside from the material poverty, there is probably also a certain type of combat for which you, if you're really not going to be engaged into massive scale encounters where you need very thick shields in the front to have this compact solid formation from the front that has to take everything that the enemy throws at you. Objectively, you don't. These smaller shields can also be the indicator of some sort of more dynamic individual combat of some sort, right? Something that you also may want to need for protecting yourself with from projectiles, especially in certain types. Especially in Norway, there was a big deal of missile warfare, more increased for reasons that we will try to explain later, but has to do also with the distances, probably the greater maritime interest that made this distance fighting more easy. You know, the Norwegian Vikings were the one that were kind of more the seamen of the situation, but not that there are massive structural differences at all, right? You know, here the material culture is pretty much homogeneous everywhere, but it's not just about poverty or availability of resources. It's also about certain types of combat for which you wanna invest in different ways. And there is always an economical principle at the base, but that includes in itself combat, not just the resources that you have to destine some of them to combat, and you have to adjust them accordingly. Talking about the dimensions of these shields in diameter, they varied, in fact, here from sort of handheld bucklers to a maximum diameter of 1 meter. That actually is not much. It's like 3.2 feet. So it's been estimated that Scandinavian people were good inches, some inches taller than the average European, but it's not in fact an excessively large shield. This flat form was more functional to shield wall formations rather than like curved concave, I don't know how to say that, shields. It's a common stereotype that the curved shield is more functional to this form of protection, but simply because with the concave one you can't overlap them, right? So if you have a very thick closed formation, you can be shoulder to shoulder with someone that in the front has maybe even a 1 meter of diameter shield that can, in this sense, even double the thickness, because it's, at least on some surface, it's like two shields overlapped one another. So this is important to think about it, because when you look at smaller kind of held bucklers dimensions, that's not meant, in fact, as we were saying before, kind of that guy didn't have enough money. It could be also about that, but that it translated in itself as a synthesis into kind of light infantry that operated into a particular way that could be equally important, because skirmishers or other runners, lighter troops, would be used even to go up, tough terrain, etc. Could be equipped that way. So it actually presents a variety, right, that is not to be found, especially in terms of light infantry at this point, much into other regions of Europe, right? Because in the Frankish world, here you have that peasantry is getting progressively disarmed by the nobility, right? And therefore you find either some decently armored town militias or city militias, and heavy cavalry of the feudal elite, but not much of a lighter troops, if not like hunters, people like that are mostly archery, kind of poor archery, right? So this dynamic is important. In Scandinavia, there is also a big deal of judicial tradition with arms. This trial by arms that is a bit distinctive of a certain culture, and reveals at that point also what the general, more than what this general civic mindset is about. It's fundamentally still tribalism. And this idea of composition, like if you make me some damage, I'll give you some damage, or if nobody can prove someone to be right or wrong, let's just make this judicial duel, and let's finish it. So is the case. In the most expansive shields, you could see reinforcement of iron band around its rim, and from 2 to 4 iron bands across the face, which naturally gave much greater resistance to the shield itself, but also made it heavier. So this also has to do with how they were factually employed. 12th century sees the general introduction of the kite-shaped shield in Scandinavia as well, right? And this was mostly used by the minority of warriors who fought on horseback. This is, in fact, the origin of kite-shaped shield are interesting. We're not going to discuss them today, but let's just, in this case, state that they were coming, at least from Scandinavia, from this general Frankish tradition, partly probably also from the Byzantine world, but generally from these lands where cavalry warfare was pretty damn developed, and the say mounted combat was becoming the rule of the essentially of the core of the army strength. So the need of these cavalrymen was to fight continuously on horseback, while up to the previous century it was much more frequent to mount, dismount, and required therefore also relatively less, a bit more flexible equipment that was a bit of a compromise. So the lengthening of this actually of the same round shield, because the kite-shaped shield seemingly evolved from the same round shield as a form, right? You can't see that from, it mostly stems from many things from the Byzantine world, but in contemporary you start finding it also in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and eventually in the use of the Normans, etc. But the concept, however, is that it evolves from that design, extending down in order to cover the leg. So this is the idea. You stay on horseback, so you're kind of exposed. You're not into a shield wall proper, because the cavalry formations are very thick at this time, but still it's kind of easier to disrupt them and to have this more individualistic movements, and then that can expose yourself. So the idea is that in order to protect the leg, in the absence of this point of further leg armor that, however, starts getting developed as a response, for which the shield will progressively not really change in shape, but rather in size up to the end of the Middle Ages to basically disappear, because at that point plate armor will render shield useless. Well, that can however protect you, especially from projectiles, right? Projectiles at this point start being more and more deadly. We will see that in 12th century Scandinavia there is a spread of crossbow, as well as in the other European regions. So this is quite important, because usually cavalry is an easy target, and when you have crossbow, you only want to hit hard at that, and you need a more protective shape for you. So this reveals and by the way, the kite-shaped shield is also kind of unwieldy for men on foot, albeit it was also used depending on forms, etc. But still, the larger one, the round one, was usually preferred. And there was some change that occurred also in later times. Maybe we can skip because we don't arrive to the 13th century, but there are naturally a bit of that change of shield form, and that the adoption of, for example, plate armor from the mid 13th century starts to produce. And in Sweden and Norway, the population was notably slower than in Denmark to take advantage of horses. Right? Denmark had this premature, not premature, but early exposure to Frankish warfare. It's also, Denmark absorbs, for evident necessities, this Frankish models in order to protect itself from the Franks themselves. This includes other political measures like Christianization, and the fact that in order to oppose such powerful militaries of the Frankish kingdoms, you really want to have a solid political enhanced military organization that entails a bit more centralization. Denmark is also kind of wealthier, right? It has also more trade interaction with the Hanseatic leagues. It has, in this sense, a easier availability of the most updated equipment coming from Central Europe. So the Danish are the ones who start looking sooner and more like continental armies than the North, that remained a bit more conservative for intrinsic limits, if anything, not much because they had chosen it. But it does correspond also to a different political mindset at that point. It is reflected by society. There are also topographic reasons. Naturally, Denmark is mostly a flatland, an open ground. Sweden is pretty forested, also marshy. Norway is, pretty mountainous, a lot of fjords, very few open plains. So it was obvious that Denmark would also, because of this, developed, earlier and more and a more effective cavalry force. And in fact, even Denmark had kind of a better road system. If anything, this in turn was a cause and consequence of this further centralization, control of the monarchy on the country, etc. Looking at the armor, there are substantial differences at this point. So by the early 11th century, mail armor was kind of universal. It had been for since ever, right? Ever since these peoples entered into the Iron Age. That's the easiest, most widespread type of armor in Europe. The Viking Age definitely is quite eloquent in this sense. And also relatively to armor, Sweden and Norway lagged behind Denmark. It's a relative statement, meaning that this speaking in terms of average, right? But in Denmark you have an earlier and more complete knight panoply based on the continental models than in these other countries. Even the knee-length hauberk appears much earlier in Denmark. It takes more time to spread elsewhere, etc. But at the same time, what is interesting and is relative mostly to Sweden, there were seemingly different traditions, different influences more than else, actually, coming from the east, right? Including for Lamellar armor, as it's actually evidenced by the finds at Birka in Mälaren that date back to between the 8th and the 9th and the 10th century. There are also 6th century sites which include to be what appear to be armor like greaves made of iron splints, right? And later on, but that's much later, there are the famous grave pits at Visby, dating from 1361, that show already coats of plates, but at that point it's not much of a novelty, meaning that coats of plates were around for the mid 13th century in Europe. And yet there are also at Visby this lamellar armor that seem rather Eastern or even non-European in origin. And this is very important because Scandinavia, especially through Sweden, Baltic Sea, and the Russian rivers, was objectively in contact with a very big net of relations, especially based on trade that reached very far, and that makes certain Scandinavian armor, in fact, looking more like Eastern, from the Eurasian steppes, or even Byzantium or the Islamic world. And in fact, this armor has striking similarities with others found even up to, for example, Transoxiana. Or so these lands where we know that actually Vikings had gone, right? So there is really nothing strange about it, but it's nevertheless very interesting because even in this relatively small region, there are substantial differences based evenly on this different orientations, mostly expansion, right? But also trade. Really, you can't find stuff coming from little Buddha statues in Norway or even something, that is normal. But it's interesting also because lamellar armor entails in here probably still, as you know, it's a pretty effective armor against missile fire, arrow fire. So we know today that actually longbow, for example, warfare was developed during the Viking era, and that it's likely that maybe this Eastern influences impacted more like regions like Sweden for at the point that the locals needed lamellar armor rather than mail armor in order to protect from missile fire. And both longbow and cavalry use are during the Viking era are being constantly reevaluated because the myth that these populations were somewhat too primitive, right, to use certain things, even in consistent numbers, is a myth that is starting to finally crumble. In my humble opinion, I would extend it also to the Anglo-Saxons, There were contexts at this point in reverse with the Anglo-Saxons in Scandinavia, especially Norway, for obvious geographical reasons. When the Normans invaded Anglo-Saxon England, many Anglo-Saxon refugees took the way of Norway, and they were important because they contributed also partly to the settlement of Norway and in the strengthening of the military system in terms of manpower, etc. So that's a fascinating thing to approach. Talking about militia, of course, if we think that things like helmets or swords were pretty rare, you can imagine what that full body armor would be even rarer. Like, so militias not necessarily had to wear this armor, but in certain cases they did. And the kilted linen or leather jerkin remained definitely a common substitute for mail, and there is actually a general consensus in thinking that most of the Leidang levy would be equipped with it, right? So that's something relatively cheap that everybody can wear, and that was probably standard for, at this point in history at least, for the regularized warfare, how it was developing at that time in terms of levy, etc. Because that makes a difference on the field, and even non-metal armor can be dramatically useful, especially in stopping certain missile fire, at least if it's not at some distance and a not really coming straight angle. But that's what you have to think like a standard, right? And naturally in this militia there was a segmentation as well, as we've seen. We don't know much about it as far as I know in terms of different classes, let's say, of equipment, but it's likely that aside from what we can find as a written evidence, the form of local military organization were largely autonomous, and actually there is no reason for which, aside from the standards of the militia, someone couldn't wear this kind of armor. After all, you could simply steal it to someone to strip from a dead enemy or something like that. So it's not really strange. Obviously, probably loot was shared in a kind of a regularized fashion in certain cases, but the idea of recruitment laws and the relative equipment is that they are dispositive, right? They don't really tell us whether what reality really was. That's an ideal picture of how men should be equipped, but reality could look very, very different. If anything, just think sometimes that we have such laws of recruitment, but we don't know how many people owned the amount of wealth that was required for every class. So that could make a substantial difference in terms of number and composition and the degree of equipment, of armament that these troops had. So talking about swords, during the Viking Age, the swords were not limited to the common Viking type with a standard pommel and straight, thick guard. This form of sword was used for cutting. It was not a thrusting weapon, at least theoretically. Its blade lacked a sharp point. It was balanced well forward, which gave this power to cut, but was unfavorable for thrusting, or unsuitable even. So nor was naturally the sword a weapon for the ordinary soldier. Axes and spears being far more common, right? Sometimes even club, telling the truth. These clubs were still used. That's how Scandinavia, in many ways, had remained to. And the club actually is could be at one point kind of the only weapon some of these militiamen could have, literally, right? Naturally, you wouldn't like to rely particularly on these troops, but the clubs also have an important effect, especially in melee, right? Because, you know, if you go to war with a club, chances are that you, in fact, you really don't have anything else, including protection and stuff. But on certain tough Scandinavian ground, in the forests, in etc., you can use this man in ambushes, but with great effect, especially consider club being a blunt, traumatic weapon, let's say, and therefore being very useful against armor, which doesn't break but can transmit its trauma underneath and making you bleed out from the within at that point. So as we were saying, swords were fairly rare in general in Scandinavia in the first place, socially speaking, and even rarer at that point among the militia, right? And so usually spears were preferred, that we will describe later, and axes as well. So the axe is naturally a pretty multi-purpose weapon. It can function well also in this kind of wild environments. You can help it to, you know, cut wood, to butcher animals, to do lots of things, and it's also a blunt weapon. It can cause internal traumas, etc. Has also a certain degree of cutting power, and therefore it would be, you know, that traditionally speaking, during the migration era, the throwing axe was also widespread everywhere, and I presume that still by the 12th century Scandinavia had some similar weapons going around. Naturally, throwing axes to be well balanced, and you have a certain skill in order to use it, and it works best in formation. So I'm actually not sure it was so widespread, but surely it was still available in some form. And there is also this bit of randomness in how swords are found, locally speaking. For example, Finland has the earliest archaeological evidence in Scandinavia for the so-called Norman sword, which had a more acute point and an almond-shaped pommel, and this was design that later came to be of dominant form up to the 13th century, albeit with a bit of variations. And that in general, however, it was not much the blade that changed at this point, but rather the pommel and guard, which means that also the way these weapons were used was evolving. But this has mostly to do with the aristocracy more than the rest, because that's where such changes would be pioneered, you know, among people who could, in the first place, to afford even to make such changes, and knowing how to use a sword, which is a very complex thing to do, and therefore these were the elites and professional, etc. And there was also local production of weapons. It was not dreadfully advanced, but still counted, which is important because certain other countries have problems in this regard. They have imported from somewhere else. And what is interesting is also the permanence of the seax in this Scandinavian warfare by the 12th century, which is a single-edged cutting weapon with a straight blade. As you know, it was used since the migration era and partly even before. Something very much similar to the later backsword of England. And this is interesting because the seax is somewhat similar to certain weapons that were used in the Islamic world at this time, and there were close trading links with those areas. And in fact, there would be other types of weapons, like the straight but single-edged palash, which is a sort of proto-saber. That was a standard word of the early medieval nomadic peoples of the steppes, and well, a heavier but still straight single-edged weapon was one of the several forms in the Islamic armies of the Middle East, Iran, and Transoxiana. So, as we were saying before, axes were quite widespread among Scandinavian troops. At this point, it was normal, as we were saying before, to leave knowing how to use an axe, knowing how to handle it, to make it to make the full use of it. And there is a sort of continuity in the use of larger, long-shafted war axes, since Viking times, even into the late medieval times in Scandinavia, which is not necessarily a symptom of particular warfare development, but it is still meaningful relatively to what in fact local warfare actually was, right? There's this emphasis on individual combat in many ways, for which the traditional housecarl, this guy armored from feet to toe at this point in history, with this double hand axe that has to run into the enemy and butcher everybody down. Something you find in this Nordic fringes of Europe. It exists also, interestingly, by Norse influence into places like Scotland and Ireland at this point. And so it's important to highlight this, because even as late as the 15th century, you find Scandinavian armored knights that are at least portrayed in battle wielding this large two-handed axes. The average axe would be something very different. It would be, smaller. One advantage of the axis is generally, in spite of its dimensions, is pretty easy to build, right? And therefore, this spoke for its effectiveness in especially in context where especially formation combat is not dramatically frequent. In terms of large like thousands of men that have all to fight together, in this sense, specializing mostly rather than counting on the individual skills, right? So in Scandinavia, we're relatively smaller armies and naturally always fighting formation, but have this more individualistic military ethos. The axe is, it answers well to that, and it kind of exalts this individualistic view of the warrior, of the fighter. And there is a limit to axes, though, that makes them confined to infantry, right? Mounted troops does not include axes, could include other weapons like even maces, clubs, etc. But naturally, double-hand axes are, not. They cannot be like double-handed swords. They can't be used on horseback, and in general, the smaller axes have a lower reach. So that's the point. It's better to have a lance naturally and a sword as a secondary weapon, or if you could have other ones. Yeah, it could be an axe, but at that point, not preferably for mounted combat, but when in other occasions, if even if you were running away and you had to maybe hide in the woods, which happened actually, so that could always come useful. And at this point, the average European knight would have as a side weapon easily a dagger a knife, something like that. So the survival of these weapons like the axe, that in its longer versions, as we've seen, could work even as a sort of saber, is very meaningful. Some of the longest swords, longest sacks that we have are dated in Lombard, Italy, that could reach even a blade of 70 centimeters. Right, it's pretty long, and that's ideal for mounted combat, especially in raiding warfare. This kind. So it's interesting that Scandinavia maintains this kind of weapons that, although probably on average are naturally shorter than that and are more similar in a conceptual use to axes for, like, not just only a weapon but a tool, a working tool sometimes, than else. The most standard weapon. So naturally, a militiaman would in Scandinavia at this point would use all these weapons, would know how to use them, and probably brought them alongside with him all the time. But definitely the most universal weapon in general, in all history, before the rise of firearms, is the spear. The spear, as you know, is a very generic term. It can be something of very different dimensions, but as we have seen, Scandinavia didn't quite have a great deal of cavalry in large numbers, because the elite was relatively, poorer and incapable of supporting it. So there was no point in equipping and training large amounts of men in formation with longer spear. The aerial lengths was designed to for mounted combat, but also countering mounted combat alike, right? So this was relatively rarer, and this naturally speaks for that kind of individualistic mindset we were hinting at before. That is, fundamentally, the longer a spear is, and the more training it requires, and the more it becomes a formation weapon. Said, the shorter the spear is, and the more it's designed for a kind of an individualistic fight. In fact, can even turn quite easily at that point into a throwing weapon, like all spears can do at the end of the day. So this is interesting, because the most widespread type of spear was the shorter infantry kind, and there could be, however, in turn, two major forms. The first one was, in fact, a throwing javelin. At the end of the day, could reach, it was roughly between 1 meter and 1.5 meters, so you understand, not particularly long. It's like between 3.2 and 4.9 feet. And then it was a heavier spear that was used as a thrusting weapon for stopping power. And this was normally about 2 meters long, right? And we have in Niels' saga from Iceland a very interesting reference also to another kind of weapon that probably, it's not a contemporary invention, but this stuff, as pole arms always were experimented in some sort. It was known as the spear axe, right? Which we don't have any archaeological find about it, but it seems to be some early form of halberd, right? Because it basically combines, is a pole arm that combines a spear, has also a point at the top, and a blade on the side. So the most obvious advantage of this is that you can pierce, you can thrust and cut at the same time. And this also gets relatively similar conceptually to to the two-handed axe. And in fact, many people believe that fundamentally such pole arms evolved from the two-handed axe. I personally don't know about this. I mean, it's possible, but not entirely aware whether this design necessarily emerges from that. And it's kind of complicated to explain now. But in any case, it's interesting because at that point, the axe is not much of a thrusting weapon. It's not an anti-cavalry weapon. So, in spite of what people usually believe, there's a beautiful video by Matt Easton that he made recently in order to answer this question exactly, talking about this large two-handed axes, talking about, from his British perspective, mostly about contexts like the Battle of Hastings, but as we know, those were essentially a Danish Anglo-Saxon culture at that point. So it's interesting because you have this ability of combining the two characters. The point, though, is that many people believe that our weapons like these are good at stopping cavalry. The problem with this spear axe is that we have no further details, I think, about it in the source. But halberds in general, if this is what this weapon looked like, are not, renownedly, by the way, an anti-cavalry weapon. Right? Halberds are not effective against cavalry. Very often, actually, they are not. But they're good anti-infantry weapon, and they have this ability, in fact, of thrusting. But also, while you thrust, when you come back, cutting with the side blade. That is quite useful because you can make horrendous wounds in this kind of throwing back movement that can even catch your enemy quite unprepared. So it even entails some kind of more sophisticated defense in this sense. And it's interesting, as we were saying before, that Scandinavian warfare is not so much about cavalry like in other areas, right? So the appearance of this kind of weapon is fascinating because it seems more like an anti-infantry type of weapon, alright, more than else. Infantry versus infantry at this point. And blades of the ordinary thrusting spears were usually short, narrow, and others were larger. It really depends. There are pros and cons, and at the end of the day, there is some degree of customization. There are also flanged or winged spears, which means they have this stopping wings on the sides that are usually thought to be, hunting weapons, or at least hunting-derived weapons. Hunt-derived weapons, in fact, known as boar spears, because the idea is that, and this functions for humans and animals alike. When you pierce someone, when you thrust someone with a spear, it actually takes a very few inches to make a little wound. But even wounding someone literally doesn't mean that he's gonna die immediately. So there is this great problem that you don't want the tip of the blade to go, too much inside to remain stuck through the bones and the human's body, and that can't keep, especially the man that you have trusted, like the animal that you have trusted, away, because especially when he's realizing his heart and is freaking out, he can not actually lose conscience, but on the contrary, fight back even more savagely. So that's extremely dangerous, and you want to keep him at a distance, right? And this is naturally typical of pole arms. And another weapon of dramatic importance in Scandinavian warfare, and it had been since the Viking era at the latest, I believe, is in fact the longbow. right? Actually, longbows are found like everywhere in Europe. Like it's not really anything related to specifically to a certain area. The European bow is only of one shape and one construction, and there is basically no difference whatsoever in the way it's made. Bows naturally are shaped with the human body, like any other weapon at this time was. So obviously, a taller fighter would use some kind of larger weapons. This is typical, even with the appearance in the 13th century, late 13th century, of double-handed swords, the double-handed axe. You need someone who is large enough to use them also effectively. This is important because it seems that, in fact, as we were saying before, longbow warfare was quite well developed in Scandinavia. And talking about militias, it wouldn't be so strange actually to have seen such a wide employment of this weapon. The reasons are multiple. First of all, in an environment where you have a lot of hunters and there is a few armor around, that's kind of a good weapon you want to use to hit your enemy at distance. Seemingly, there was some incidents of sort in Norway. I believe, as an hypothesis, mostly because of more advanced, more intense, at least, naval warfare, and this kind of because of this particular topographic character of Norway that mostly has to rely on maritime travels, because the hinterland is tough to go through. So this distance missile exchange was vital. We know also in naval warfare, by the way. Today we didn't talk much about naval warfare, but also in their weaponry were kind of similar. The average missile that the crews would bring would in fact be bows, and even stones to throw at a closer range when the enemy vessels approached. So this is very interesting because there is a lot of prejudice still after years and years of historiography about which we know that things were not like this, for which we think the longbow is just the 14th century English tactics that survived also in the 15th largely, and even in the 16th at a certain point, but it's mostly about England, right? This is not really true, right? And there is even the myth that the longbow is a kind of a national weapon somehow. I think the worst wrong people in this sense are those who believe that the longbow is a kind of a Welsh invention. The Welsh have absolutely nothing to do with the creation and invention of longbows, and as far as we know, they weren't even better or worse, for that matter, longbowmen than the English were or any other people was, right? And now that I think about it, this broader use that we seem to witness in Northern Europe proper of bows and longbows in general is quite fascinating, because there are direct links. Lots of longbows found in Viking graves, even from the Viking era, and therefore telling us that there was some sort of reliance and spread of this weapon. It was very important, especially naval warfare, repeated, because eventually naval warfare would be crossbow, would make a big deal of difference, at least in the Mediterranean. So this reliance for naturally missile weapons in maritime warfare was very, very important. That's why in the Viking era probably it was so widespread. But that stuff you can't find in Denmark, I think, since the time of the Roman Empire's finds. So there's really nothing strange about it. And so, relatively to longbow, the employment en masse was pretty fitting for militias, right? There is actually no better. Most of recruitment laws Europe-wide, actually worldwide in general, prescribed the bow, as and quiver, as the equipment for the lower class of recruitment of troops. And so conceptually, you see, it's definitely not strange to have this kind of weapons around in large number. Especially if you look at the migration era, from which it seems that Scandinavia retained so much until very late in time. You realize that probably in an average battle of the time there would be really a lot of arrows going around, right? Many people say, well, this has also to do with the influence of the steppes during the migration era. That's true, but don't underestimate also certain aspects of that, certain perspectives, like for the average Indo-European warrior, especially properly European warrior in the West, this idea of hitting an enemy at a distance with a missile weapon, something it was considered something shameful, a sort of stigma that you find, though, very widespread basically all over the Indo-European tradition, all mythologies, etc., especially in the West. And this disturbing frequency, especially in the Germanic sagas, when the hero is always killed at the end of the way in a sort of a non-really virile way. The hero is the symbol of masculinity, of warrior, ethos, of pride, of strength. It always gets killed in a kind of a sneaky way. Like hidden from the. Think about Siegfried is killed with from the behind, or Alpvin that is killed because his sword has been tied to the bed. So all this non loyal ways of killing the hero, right? And that reveal largely the problem was a reflection in the cultural, maybe not rationalization, but evidence that actually such weapons were much more widespread and used than what the official culture wanted to portray. Because also what we look at in the sources is not like engravings of the average militiaman, of the levy trooper, the guy who was simply living more like in the zip than in the comitatus, right? The peasant. In this Germanic world, being a peasant means to be kind of something similar to a serf, right? The true warrior fights, and that what should be into a military retinue, etc. But it's pretty self-evident that the bow is universally spread weapon that every kind of culture uses, and is a relatively cheap weapon which an hunter can that can easily get skilled living in the wild, like Scandinavia largely was. So yeah, probably was much more arrows flying around than we can imagine. This probably was reflected also in the militia, right? In the militia you start finding this time also crossbows. There are sometimes even issued, and there are fines, etc. But probably was a lot of arrows in general from bows, right? It would be really it's important to consider that factor in this world. But I repeat, there's a very few amount of armor, so using arrow is a pretty sensible choice, right? And then all the influences that surely existed from the steppes, right? Especially from the Varangians. In Russia, we know that there were these semi-nomadic or nomadic peoples that made use of such weapons, and that were definitely they definitely had an impact on. But even this consideration is valid as a whole also for the rest of Europe, like even for the Frankish Empire, for the post-Carolingian world at this point, and high medieval powers, even for the Byzantines. The use of missile weapons was much more widespread than what were commonly thought to believe. That's also why you needed infantry. You needed infantry that could exhaust the other enemy's infantry in this process, even in terms of this cavalry being born on the feudal Western feudal model. especially if you have this elite that you're nurturing quite, patiently, and that you don't want to be taken out on the field by someone else. Of course, there is also the contrary, meaning that this society was struggling to disarm the peasantry, as we've seen, but this wouldn't never achieve the levels that places like France would achieve, for example, where the peasantry is not much more warriors anymore. They're just peasants, right? And hence Lamellar armor, as we were saying before. So all of this kind of, albeit a bit in a blurred fashion, but draws a picture that is fundamentally coherent. And that's why the militias would be the average pool, probably, of this bow troops. And naturally, also in here, there is a difference between the use of bows in terms of formation and individual fight, because using bows in formation is much different than using them individually. Not because in formation it's more difficult to take an aim, for example. It's quite the contrary. You don't have to aim at that point. You're just, looking at a formation, throwing the arrow in a direction would make you hit the formation, but without aiming the single soldier as a marksman. The problem of these larger formations is to shoot all at once, right? Because if you there is a great difference if you shoot all this great amount of even the same amount of time, all this amount of arrows in a single moment, or diluted in the same amount of time between the pose of the various shots, because shooting these arrows all at once has a much more devastating effect, but psychologically in terms of the solidity of the formation, that if you throw them kind of continuously in an uncoordinated way. Naturally, on a battlefield, that's where you start distinguishing units that are maybe individually less skilled with weapons, but at least able to discipline and trade enough for formation dynamics. And that's where the greater, the collective training, let's say, wins over the individual one. Because you can have hunters that are perfect marksmen, right, for the time standards with the bow, but they're not capable of concentrated fire on the battlefield because they're too undisciplined and not framed under, an authority that can give them that kind of training. This is important because it has to do indeed with the thing we began with in the first place, with this problem of Scandinavian monarchies to trying to acquire more control in society, when a society was largely conservative and traditionalist in these matters, and that had the power to maintain things more unchanged than before, than in other countries. But with a loss at the end of the day, because Scandinavian monarchies remained essentially weak until the end of the Middle Ages. Even the rise of the Hanseatic League, etc., could even hit some of the, for example, most important Danish, Swedish centers as if it was nothing. That caused certain structural weakness. So there's always this paradox that a more centralized society is more functional, but it has less freedom of its individuals, right? So warfare is reflected in this way. That is, armies work better on the field if they have kind of more pressure from the above as a society, because they can be trained more intensely, even against their will sometimes, and whatever. So yeah, this is the general concept of the militia, and always remember the broader picture I gave you, those videos at the beginning that deal with these problems a bit more at large. And as you understand, we're talking about the 12th century. There are not massive technological differences in Europe, etc., but it's exactly this homogeneity that allows you to isolate more easily what is kind of different right, on a structural level, on average, in relative terms, that at the end of the day, it always reflects something, some logical, political, and social condition that brought to that. And okay, I think we can stop for now, and we will naturally keep talking about Scandinavian warfare in our journey through medieval warfare in general. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.